Okay, so in Egypt in 1798, Napoleon invaded and defeated the Mamluk forces. Then 15 months later, he encountered many military defeats, so he returned to France and seized power and made himself emperor. Then in 1801, after a long power struggle between Muhammad Ali and Napoleon, Muhammad Ali emerged as the victor. After gaining power in Egypt, Muhammad Ali established many schools to train modern military officers, and he also built factories to supply his new army. Then in the 1830s, Muhammad's son invaded Syria and started a similar set of reforms there. Also, Muhammad remained Egypt's ruler until 1849, and his family held on to power until 1952.
At the end of the 18th century, Sultan Selim III introduced reforms to strengthen the military and the central government, and these reforms aroused the opposition of Janissaries, the nobility, and ulama, and this sparked a Janissary revolt in Serbia. So, Sultan Mehmed II believed that the loss of Greece was a weakness in the Ottoman military and their financial organization, and he used popular outrage over the loss of Greece to justify a series of reforms that included the creation of new army corps, and they eliminated the Janissaries. So then there were educational reforms that really stimulated the growth of the wealth and the influence of the urban elites, and they brought about unexpected cultural and social effects. So then Russia expanded towards the south, and this was at the expense of the Ottoman Empire, which ultimately led to the Crimean War. And Britain, France allied with the Ottoman Empire, and they defeated Russia and then blocked Russia's expansion into Eastern Europe and the Middle East. So then Britain and France carried out extensive propaganda campaigns that emphasized their roles in the war, and the French press promoted a sense of unity between Turkish and French society. So the Crimean War marked the transition from traditional to modern warfare, which included the invention of machine guns and the use of railways to transfer weapons and men. And after the Crimean War, there was also the transition of the population from rural to urban areas and the development of professional and wage labor classes, but this did not solve the regime's fiscal problems. So then the Ottoman state really depended on foreign loans, and there was a trade deficit and inflation. Because of this, there were a lot of Muslim hostilities against Christians in the Ottoman territories. Then a group of educated urban men, known as the Young Ottomans, banded together, but the Ottoman Empire still weakened existence.
In the early 1700s, Russia aspired to Western-style economic development, but fear of political change prevented real progress. Nonetheless, Russia had more in common with other European nations than it did the Ottoman Empire. Slavophiles and Westernizers debated the proper course for Russian development, and then the diplomatic inclusion of Russia among the great powers of Europe was countered by a powerful sense of Russophobia in the West. By the end of the 18th century, the Russian Empire had reached the Pacific Ocean and the borders of China. In the 19th century, Russian expansion continued to the south, bringing Russia into conflict with China, Japan, Iran, and the Ottoman Empire. Then Britain took steps to halt Russian expansion before Russia gained control of all of Central Asia.
The reforms of Alexander I promised more on paper than they actually delivered in practice. Opposition to reform came from wealthy families who feared that reform would bring about imperial despotism, a fear that was realized during the reign of Nicholas I. The December's revolt was then carried out by a group of reform-minded military officers upon the death of Alexander I, and this eliminated reform for the next 3 decades.
After the Qing conquered China in the 1600s, they restored peace and stability and promoted the recovery and expansion of the agricultural economy. This laid the foundation for the doubling of the Chinese population. By 1800, population pressure was causing a lot of environmental damage. There were many different sources of discontent in Qing China. Various minority people had been driven off their land, and many people regarded the government as being weak and corrupt. These discontents manifested a series of internal rebellions, and in the 19th century it began with the White Lotus Rebellion. Believing the Europeans to be a remote and relatively unimportant people, the Qing did not at first pay much attention to trade issues or the growth in opium trade. Then in 1939, the Qing government realized the harm being done by the opium trade, so they decided to ban the use and import of opium, and they sent Lin Zexu to Canton to deal with the matter. The attempt to ban the opium trade led to the Opium War, in which the British forces defeated the Qing and forced them to sign the Treaty of Nanking. This treaty resulted in the colonization of small pockets of Qing territory.
Then the Taiping Rebellion broke out in the Guangxi province, where poor farmland, endemic poverty, and economic distress were complicated by ethnic divisions that relegated the minority Hakka people to the lowliest trades. Hongzhi Khan founded the Taiping movement, and he declared himself to be the younger brother of Jesus and founded a religious group. The Taiping forces then defeated the imperial troops in Guangxi and captured Nanjing and made it the capital of their heavenly kingdom of great peace. So then the Qing were finally able to defeat the Taiping with help from military forces, and the Taiping Rebellion ended up being one of the world's bloodiest civil wars and the greatest armed conflict before the 20th century. After the 1850s, the expenses of wars and the burden of indemnities payable to Western governments made it possible for the Qing to get out of debt. With the Qing government so deeply in their debt, Britain and France then became active participants in the period of recovery known as the Tongzhi Restoration that followed the Taiping Rebellion. The real work of recovery was managed by provincial governors like Zhang Guofan, who looked to the United States as his model and worked to restore agriculture, reform the military, and industrialize armaments manufacture. The reform programs were supported by a coalition of Qing aristocrats, including the Empress Dowager Cixi, but they were unable to prevent the Qing Empire from disintegrating into a set of large power zones in which provincial governors exercised real authority.